Welcome to your Get That Nugget for GCSE English Literature. Today we're going to be focusing on the Love and Relationships anthology and how we would approach annotating and structuring an essay for those questions. This session is meant to complement your lessons with your teachers and not to replace them in any way. So just want to recap what we looked at before. So when we were looking at the unseen poetry, we looked at this idea of list and the fact that you could unpick a poem focusing on language, imagery, structure and theme, and that you could then use that to structure your essay. That is essentially what we're going to be doing again today, but understanding that with the anthology poem, you are also going to need to include context in that. So the difference between this is that you are now being tested on AO 1, 2 and 3. You need to write about 2 poems, and that you need to be able to find similarities and differences between the 2 poems. So we're going to start today with The Farmer's Bride. You will already have looked at this with your teacher. The point of today is not to go through it and annotate the poem. The point of today is that we are going to look at how we could focus on identifying quotations for language, imagery, structure and theme, looking at how the poet presents relationships. So if we have that as our focus, because we always need to keep the question in mind, and then the first thing we're going to do is we're going to be looking for our language quotation. So language, again, remembering we can be looking for word classes, we can be looking for semantic field, we can be looking for specific pronouns, we can be looking for anything that groups those words together. So if we look at this, we have several different ways we can go around that. We're only going to look at the first 3 stanzas to stop us having to keep turning it over, but obviously there are 2 halves to this poem. If we look at those first 3 stanzas, and we're going to look at the idea of a hare, we're going to look at the idea of beasts in a stall, we're going to look at the idea of a frightened fae, which is a young animal, and we're going to start to see that we have the semantic field of nature and animals. And once we have that, we need to identify why the poet is doing that. So in the first instance, you have the idea that relationships are a natural thing, that he believes that their relationship should be a natural thing. You then have the idea of animals, and this sense, especially as a farmer, that there is ownership or superiority over animals. You then have the idea that these animals are hunted in some way. All of that will lead you on to the idea contextually that we are talking about a time when women were not necessarily free to choose who they were going to marry. Okay, so if you look at how that's been unpicked, we have the semantic field of nature and animals. You would use those quotations that we've highlighted there. You then unpick it in terms of nature linking to the idea of relationships being natural, animals linking to the idea of ownership and superiority, which further takes us onto the idea of being hunted in some way. And this leads us to AO3, women not being free to choose who they married. So you can see we've got all 3 assessment objectives there. In terms of imagery, if we start to look through again, we are looking for metaphors, we are looking for similes, and here we have like a mouse. And so we're looking at the fact that that use of a simile compares her to an animal, but specifically we are looking at a tiny animal. We are looking at an animal that is fearful, that is, again, has lots of natural predators that are hard to see, hard to catch. And again, we go back to this idea of inequality in a relationship. So there is our quotation in terms of how that fits in with the list structure. We've identified the technique, explained what it means, and then unpicked that further, specifically focusing on the use of mouse rather than any other sort of animal. And again, this suggests that inequality in relationships. So we're then looking at structure, and there are several things we can look at. We have the use of direct speech here. We have the use of these dashes, which suggests that he is thinking, that he is in conversation, he is talking about this to someone. Suggests that he is, contemplating what's happening, what's going on. You've also got the choice of the first person narrative. This is his story. And what we're going to look at is we're going to look at the fact that it's his story, it's the first person narrative. And again, that tells us about their relationship. It's his point of view. It's his ideas. And again, because it is in his voice and it is the farmer's bride, it suggests ownership. So again, we are looking at that inequality in relationship. But obviously linking that to the expectations of the time. And then we have the final thing we need to look at, which is the theme. So the big idea of this poem, the idea that regardless of whether he chose that wife, regardless of whether he catches her and locks her up, he cannot make her love him, and that he becomes sort of slightly obsessed. In terms of the quotation we could use for this, if we're looking at this first side, we can look at this quotation here. We caught her, fetched her home at last, and turned the key upon her fast. So there is a sort of wider thing at play here. The use of we is the idea of a male-dominated society. The idea that they cannot keep women locked up, they cannot keep women quiet. And in order to try and do so, they are locking her up. Turned the key upon her fast suggests a lack of freedom. Again, it suggests the caging of an animal. And therefore, the sort of bigger idea behind this poem is about relationships, is about marriage, is about society. It is a commentary on society, and much like the animals in the poem, the woman cannot be locked up. So this is what we end up with in terms of unpicking the poem with language, imagery, structure and theme. And so overall, what we can say, if we are looking at how does the poet present relationships, This relationship is presented as unequal. This relationship is presented as oppressive, and yet in the wider context of things, there is the suggestion that this can never work as a relationship. What I want to leave you with, and this essentially will be your theme paragraph: what is the farmer's attitude towards his bride? Use at least one quotation to support your answer. What does he expect from her? He expects obedience. How do we know that doesn't happen? Because he needs to lock her up and take away her freedom. How does that relate to the wider world? Typical of the time, and therefore it is no surprise that it is a female poet making a comment.